This is the story of the most audacious voyage ever attempted by human beings. A journey that would take 270 men into waters no European had ever sailed, through straits that might not exist, across an ocean whose size nobody could imagine. It was a voyage that would kill most who attempted it, including the man who dreamed it into being. Its commander was Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing under a Spanish flag, driven by a mixture of genius, faith, and wounded pride that would ultimately destroy him. What followed was 3 years of mutiny, starvation, and unimaginable discovery that would finally prove what scholars had long suspected but never confirmed, that the Earth was indeed round and far larger than anyone had dared to imagine. As a note, my main reference is the extraordinary journal of Antonio Pigafetta, an Italian nobleman who joined the expedition for adventure and ended up writing one of the most remarkable eyewitness accounts in the history of exploration. His observations are vivid, strange, and often disturbing. Through his eyes, we will witness humanity's first journey around the entire planet. But Pigafetta wasn't the only chronicler. There were also the testimonies from the San Antonio deserters, the survivors' depositions to the Spanish court, Portuguese spies' reports, and letters from participants that didn't survive. Together, they paint a picture of an expedition that was miraculous and horrific in equal measure. So let us begin this epic voyage that would change our understanding of the world forever. In the spring of 1519, Ferdinand Magellan stood on the docks of Seville, watching his 5 ships being loaded with supplies for a journey that most believed was impossible. The morning mist rose from the Guadalquivir River, and the air smelled of tar, hemp, and the sweat of men loading cargo. He was 39 years old, walked with a pronounced limp from an old battle wound, and spoke Spanish with a thick Portuguese accent that marked him immediately as an outsider. His beard was already streaked with gray, his skin weathered from years under foreign suns, and his dark eyes held an intensity that made men uncomfortable. Some said it was the look of genius, others said it was madness. The Spanish sailors loading his ships muttered among themselves in the Andalusian dialect, their words carrying across the water. Why was a Portuguese commanding this Spanish expedition? Why had their young king chosen this foreigner to lead what could be the most important voyage in Spanish history? They had their own experienced navigators, men who had sailed with Columbus's successors, men who knew the Atlantic and its moods. Yet here was this limping Portuguese, given command of 5 ships and the lives of 270 men. The resentment was palpable. Spain and Portugal were bitter rivals, competing for every new island, every trade route, every ounce of gold and grain of spice that could be wrested from the newly discovered lands. Portuguese sailors who switched sides were seen as worse than enemies. They were traitors. And Magellan wasn't just any Portuguese sailor. He had served in India, fought in Malacca, knew Portuguese state secrets about navigation routes and the true location of the Spice Islands. His defection was a betrayal of the highest order. They didn't know it yet, but these questions and resentments would soon turn into open rebellion. The seeds of mutiny were being planted with every suspicious glance, every whispered complaint, every reluctant salute to the foreign commander. But before we follow Magellan into the unknown, it's worth understanding how he got here, how a Portuguese nobleman ended up betraying his homeland to sail for Spain's glory. It's a story of ambition, humiliation, and revenge that would drive him to attempt the impossible. Ferdinand Magellan, or Fernão de Magalhães, as he was known in Portugal, was born around 1480 in Sabrosa, a small town in northern Portugal. His family were minor nobility, hidalgos who owned a small estate but wielded no real power. His father, Pedro Ruy de Magalhães, had served the Portuguese crown and earned enough favor to secure positions at court for his children. His mother, Alda de Mesquita, came from a family with stronger noble connections which would prove crucial for young Ferdinand's future. When Ferdinand was just 10 years old, both his parents died. The exact cause is lost to history. Perhaps plague, perhaps accident, perhaps the casual violence that claimed so many lives in 15th century Portugal. Ferdinand and his brother Diogo were orphaned, their sister Isabel sent to live with relatives. The boys' inheritance was modest, not enough to live as nobles without working. They needed positions, patronage, a path to advancement. At age 12, Ferdinand became a page in the Portuguese royal court of King John II and later Queen Leonor. This was where he first heard tales of the Indies, of spices worth more than gold, of kingdoms beyond imagination. The Portuguese court in the 1490s was the center of the world's most advanced maritime nation. Prince Henry the Navigator's legacy lived on in the maps and charts kept under lock and key, in the mathematical instruments that could find latitude by the stars, in the accumulated knowledge of winds and currents that Portuguese sailors guarded as state secrets. Young Magellan served the royal family, but he also studied. He learned mathematics, astronomy, and navigation from the court's experts. He studied the reports of Bartholomew Dias, who had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans connected. He was at court when Vasco da Gama returned in 1499 from his epic-making voyage to India, bringing spices that sold for 60 times their purchase price. The halls buzzed with talk of untold wealth waiting in the East for those brave enough to claim it. But Magellan was also there when Columbus returned from his voyages, claiming to have reached the Indies by sailing west. The Portuguese knew better. Columbus had found new lands, yes, but not the Indies. The real Indies, the source of spices and silk, lay to the east. Portugal controlled that route around Africa. It was their monopoly, their divine right, confirmed by papal bull and treaty, or so they believed. At 25, Magellan finally got his chance to see these wonders himself. In 1505, he enlisted in the fleet of Dom Francisco de Almeida, the first viceroy of Portuguese India. The fleet consisted of 22 ships and 1,500 men, tasked with establishing permanent Portuguese control over the Indian Ocean trade routes. Magellan served as a sobresaliente, a junior officer with a soldier's training and a noble's education. He was eager, ambitious, ready to make his fortune in the fabled East. The voyage to India took 6 months, following the route Vasco da Gama had pioneered. Down the African coast, past the Canary Islands, around the Great Bulge of West Africa, through the doldrums where ships sat becalmed for weeks, around the Cape of Good Hope, where storms could destroy a fleet in minutes, then north through the Mozambique Channel to the trading cities of East Africa, and finally across to India itself. For 8 years, Magellan served in the East. He was at the Battle of Diu in 1509, where a Portuguese fleet destroyed a combined force of Ottoman, Mamluk, and Indian ships, establishing Portuguese dominance over the Indian Ocean. He fought pirates in the Strait of Malacca, negotiated with sultans in Sumatra, and learned the complex web of trade that connected India, China, Japan, and the Spice Islands. He became fluent in Malay, the lingua franca of maritime Southeast Asia. He studied Islam and Hinduism, not from religious interest, but to understand his enemies and trading partners. It was during this time that Magellan formed the most important friendship of his life. Francisco Serão was a fellow Portuguese officer, brave to the point of recklessness, loyal beyond question. In 1511, they fought together in the conquest of Malacca, the great trading city that controlled the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. During the assault on the city, Serão's boat capsized in the harbor. He was drowning, weighed down by armor, when Magellan dove in and saved him. It was a debt Serão would never forget. After Malacca fell, Serão was sent on an expedition to find the Spice Islands, the legendary Moluccas where cloves and nutmeg grew wild. These islands were the ultimate prize, the source of spices that Europeans craved for preserving food, making medicine, and displaying wealth. A single shipload of cloves could make a man rich for life. The location of these islands was a closely guarded secret, known only through rumors and the tales of Arab and Malay traders. Serão's expedition found the islands, but his ship was wrecked in a storm. He washed ashore on Ternate, one of the main spice islands, where the Sultan welcomed him as a useful ally against local rivals. Serão decided to stay. He married a local woman, had children, became the Sultan's military advisor. He had found paradise, or so his letters to Magellan suggested, letters that would change the course of history. These letters, sent through the irregular channels of Portuguese trade, painted a picture of islands where spices grew like weeds, where a handful of cloves could buy a man's freedom, where the sultans were eager for European weapons and knowledge. But Cerro also included crucial information. The islands were much farther east than Portuguese maps showed. So far east, in fact, that they might actually fall on Spain's side of the world if one accepted the division established by the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty, signed in 1494, had literally divided the undiscovered world between Spain and Portugal. A line was drawn 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal, everything to the west to Spain. The treaty made sense for the Atlantic, but what about the other side of the world? Where did Portuguese territory end and Spanish begin on the far side of the globe? Nobody knew, because nobody had been there. But if Cerro was right about the location of the Spice Islands, they might legally belong to Spain if only Spain could reach them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back in 1512, Magellan was still a loyal Portuguese subject, fighting for his king in Morocco. The Portuguese were trying to establish a North African empire to control the southern shore of the Mediterranean. It was brutal warfare against Berber and Arab forces who knew the terrain and fought with desert-hardened ferocity. In 1513, during an assault on the Moroccan city of Azamur, a Berber lance found a gap in Magellan's armor and shattered his knee. The wound was catastrophic. The lance point drove deep into the joint, tearing cartilage and tendons. In an age before antibiotics or proper surgery, such wounds usually meant death from infection or permanent crippling. Magellan survived, but his leg never properly healed. He would limp for the rest of his life, the leg sometimes giving out without warning, causing him to stumble or fall. For a man who prided himself on physical courage, it was a daily humiliation. Worse was to come. While recovering from his wound, Magellan was accused of trading illegally with the Moors. The accusation came from Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese governor of India, who had never liked Magellan. The charges were probably false. Magellan vehemently denied them, but the damage was done. His reputation was stained. When he returned to Portugal in 1514 and requested an increase in his moradia, royal pension, from the king, it should have been routine. He was a noble who had served faithfully for 8 years in the East, been wounded in the king's service, and deserved recognition. King Manuel I of Portugal, known as Manuel the Fortunate, was one of the richest monarchs in Europe thanks to the spice trade. He could afford to be generous with loyal servants. But when Magellan stood before him in the great hall of the Ribeira Palace in Lisbon, something went wrong. Perhaps it was Magellan's manner. He was never good at court politics, too direct, too intense. Perhaps the king had heard the rumors from Morocco. Perhaps he simply didn't like this minor noble who walked with a limp and spoke with the harsh accent of the northern provinces. The king refused, not just the increase, but any recognition of Magellan's service. It was a public humiliation. Magellan tried again, and again was refused. On his third attempt, the king's patience snapped. When Magellan asked if he could offer his services to another monarch, expecting the king to reconsider, Manuel told him to do whatever he wished. The king, he made clear, did not care what happened to Ferdinand Magellan. Imagine that moment. Magellan had spent his entire adult life serving Portugal. He had killed for Portugal, bled for Portugal, spent years in fetid eastern ports expanding Portugal's empire. And now, Portugal's king dismissed him like a servant who had outlived his usefulness. Some courtiers reported that Magellan's face went white, then red. He bowed stiffly, turned, and limped from the hall. He would never return to Portugal again. That rejection changed everything. It transformed Magellan from a loyal, if ambitious servant into something else, a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. He had knowledge that could change the balance of world power, and Portugal didn't want it. So he made a decision that his countrymen would never forgive. He would go to Spain. But first, he needed allies, information, and a plan. In Lisbon's port district, away from the palace, Magellan met with Rui Falero, a cosmographer with a brilliant mind and an unstable temperament. Falero claimed to have solved the problem of longitude, how to determine one's east-west position at sea. This was the holy grail of navigation. Latitude could be found by measuring the sun or stars, but longitude was guesswork based on speed and time. If Falero was right, they could navigate with unprecedented precision. Falero was also possibly insane. He had violent mood swings, heard voices, believed he could predict the future through astrology. But his mathematical work was sound, his maps were excellent, and most importantly, he hated the Portuguese establishment as much as Magellan did. They had dismissed his theories, mocked his claims, refused to fund his research. Together, these two rejected men began planning their revenge. They also recruited a third conspirator, Duarte Barbosa, a Portuguese who had spent years in India and was now living in Seville. Barbosa had written a detailed account of Eastern trade, including information about the Spice Islands that corroborated Cerrot's letters. He also had something else valuable: Spanish connections. His father worked for the Spanish crown, and Duarte himself had established relationships with Seville's merchant community. Through the summer of 1517, these three men refined their plan. They would offer Spain what Columbus had promised but failed to deliver: a western route to the Indies. But unlike Columbus, they knew exactly where they were going. Magellan had Cerrot's letters describing the exact location of the Spice Islands. He had Portuguese charts stolen or memorized, showing a possible strait through South America. He had practical experience navigating eastern waters. This wasn't speculation, it was a business proposition based on inside information. In October 1517, Magellan arrived in Seville with his plan, his maps, and his slave Enrique. This last figure deserves special attention. Enrique, also recorded as Enrique, was described in documents as Magellan's slave from Malacca, but his true origin is one of history's great mysteries. Magellan claimed he bought Enrique in Malacca in 1511, but some historians believe Enrique was actually from the Philippines or even the Moluccas themselves. Why does this matter? Because if Enrique was from the Eastern Islands and returned home by sailing west with Magellan, he would become the first person to circumnavigate the globe, not the European sailors who claimed that honor. Enrique spoke Malay fluently, but when they later reached the Philippines, he could also communicate with the natives there. Was this because Malay was a trade language or because he was speaking his native tongue? We'll never know for certain, but Enrique's presence would prove crucial to the expedition's survival. Seville, in 1517, was the beating heart of Spanish exploration. Every expedition to the Americas left from here, and every treasure fleet returned here. The city's narrow streets were crowded with sailors from a dozen nations, merchants trading in exotic goods, mapmakers guarding their secrets, and adventurers seeking backers for impossible schemes. The Cathedral of Seville, the largest Gothic church in the world, loomed over it all, a monument to the wealth flowing in from the New World. But Seville was also a city of suspicion and intrigue. The Spanish Inquisition had its headquarters here, always watching for heretics and spies. Portuguese agents moved through the taverns and docks, gathering intelligence on Spanish plans. Every foreign sailor was potentially a spy. Every new map might contain strategic secrets. Into this paranoid atmosphere walked Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese noble offering to betray his country's greatest secrets. The Casa de Contratación, the house of trade that controlled all Spanish colonial commerce, received Magellan with deep skepticism. Juan de Aranda, the factor of the Casa, saw an opportunity for personal profit and became Magellan's advocate, but for a price. He wanted an eighth of all profits from the expedition. It was extortion, but Magellan had no choice. Without Aranda's support, he would never get an audience with the king. The Spanish court was then in Valladolid, a landlocked city that seemed an unlikely place to plan ocean voyages. 17-year-old King Charles I had been on the throne for just a year. He was actually Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, a Habsburg who spoke better French and Flemish than Spanish. His advisors were mostly Flemish, which the Spanish nobility resented. The young king was intelligent but inexperienced, eager to prove himself worthy of his vast inheritance. When Magellan was finally granted an audience in February 1518, he came prepared. He brought globes showing his proposed route, charts revealing Portuguese secrets, and Rui Falero with his mathematical proofs. But most importantly, he brought certainty. Where other explorers offered vague promises of gold and glory, Magellan offered specific, achievable goals. find the strait through South America, cross the sea beyond, reach the Spice Islands, load the ships with cloves, return to Spain. The presentation was masterful. Magellan spoke of his years in the East, his personal knowledge of the waters and peoples. He showed the king letters from Francisco Serrão, a Portuguese officer writing to a Portuguese navigator, unquestionably authentic. He demonstrated on the globe how the Spice Islands, properly measured, fell on Spain's side of the Tordesillas line. Spain had a legal right to these islands, they just needed to reach them from the west. But what really convinced the young king was Magellan's religious argument. This voyage wasn't just about spices and gold. It was about spreading Christianity to lands that had never heard of Christ. The natives of these islands were pagans and Muslims, their souls condemned to hell unless someone brought them the gospel. By sailing west, Spain could claim not just wealth, but souls for God. For a young king eager to prove his piety, this was compelling. The Portuguese ambassador Álvaro da Costa tried desperately to stop the agreement. He accused Magellan of being a traitor and a fraud. He claimed the maps were forgeries, the plan impossible. He even tried to bribe Magellan to return to Portugal, offering full pardon and rewards. When that failed, he likely ordered Magellan's assassination. Portuguese agents began following Magellan through Seville's streets. One night, a gang of Portuguese sailors attacked him near the river. Magellan fought them off with his sword, but the message was clear. Portugal wanted him dead. On March 22, 1518, King Charles signed the capitulations, the contract that would send Magellan on his voyage. The terms were generous. Magellan would get a 20th of all profits, hereditary rights to govern any lands he discovered, and a monopoly on the route for 10 years. He was made a Knight of the Order of Santiago, Spain's most prestigious chivalric order. For a Portuguese exile, it was an extraordinary vindication, but the king, perhaps wisely, perhaps foolishly, added provisions that would nearly destroy the expedition. He insisted that Spanish nobles command 4 of the 5 ships. Magellan could choose his flagship's crew, but the others would be mostly Spanish. A Spanish royal inspector would accompany the fleet to ensure the king's interests were protected. These provisions were meant to prevent a Portuguese takeover of a Spanish expedition. Instead, they guaranteed conflict. The Spanish captains appointed were a mix of incompetence and hostility. Juan de Cartagena, made captain of the San Antonio and inspector general of the fleet, was the illegitimate son of the Bishop of Burgos. He had court connections but no real sailing experience. He viewed Magellan as an upstart foreigner who should be grateful for Spanish generosity, not giving orders to Spanish nobles. Gaspar de Quesada, captain of the Concepcion, was another courtier with little sea experience but a massive ego. Luis de Mendoza, captain of the Victoria, at least knew how to sail but resented taking orders from a Portuguese. Only Juan Serrão, given command of the small Santiago, seemed willing to accept Magellan's authority. Serrão was Portuguese but had lived in Spain for years. Some historians think he was related to Francisco Serrão, Magellan's friend in the Moluccas, though this isn't certain. The 5 ships themselves were not the grand vessels you might imagine. They were used ships, purchased cheap and refitted for the voyage. The Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, displaced just 110 tons. The San Antonio, the largest at 120 tons, was still smaller than a modern yacht. The Conception at 90 tons, the Victoria at 85 tons, and the Santiago at just 75 tons were barely more than large boats by modern standards. These ships, called carracks or naus, were broad-beamed, high-sided, and slow. They were designed for cargo, not speed or maneuverability. The condition of these ships was questionable. The Trinidad had been used in the African trade and showed signs of worm damage. The San Antonio leaked even in harbor. Spanish shipyard officials, eager to profit, claimed the vessels were seaworthy while pocketing money meant for repairs. Magellan spent months fighting for proper maintenance, making enemies with every complaint. The Spanish suppliers were systematically corrupt, delivering less than contracted and inferior quality. Where Magellan ordered 2,156 pounds of biscuits, they delivered 1,710. Where he ordered good wine, they provided vinegar barely fit for preserving. The gunpowder was damp, The ropes were rotten, and everyone involved expected bribes. Loading the ships became a battle of wills. Magellan knew that supplies would determine success or failure. He needed food for 2 years for 270 men, 21,400 pounds of biscuits, 5,700 gallons of wine, 5,600 pounds of salt pork, 2,870 pounds of cheese, 1,512 pounds of honey, 200 barrels of sardines, 984 pounds of dried fish. He needed materials for repairs, extra sails, miles of rope, tar for waterproofing, iron for the forge, wood for the carpenter. He needed trade goods, 20,000 bells, 400 dozen knives, 1,000 mirrors, tons of cloth in bright colors that might appeal to unknown peoples. The human cargo was equally complex. The 270 men, the exact number varies in different accounts, came from across Europe. The largest contingent was Spanish, about 160 men, mostly from Andalusia. There were 40 Portuguese, including Magellan's most trusted officers. The rest were Italian, French, German, Greek, English, and even one man from Rhodes. There was Master Andrew of Bristol, the sole Englishman, who served as a gunner. There was Antonio Pigafetta, the Venetian scholar who would become the expedition's chronicler. Pigafetta deserves special attention because without him, we would know far less about this voyage. He was about 28 years old, from a noble family in Vicenza. He had studied astronomy, geography, and cartography. He was in Spain as part of a papal delegation when he heard about Magellan's expedition. Something about the Portuguese captain's conviction captivated him. He requested permission to join not as an officer, but as a sobresaliente, a gentleman volunteer. He brought his own supplies and asked no salary, only the chance to see wonders. From the beginning, Pigafetta hero-worshipped Magellan. His journal, while invaluable, is heavily biased in Magellan's favor. He portrays the Captain General as divinely inspired, the Spanish captains as jealous traitors, and the voyage as a holy mission. Yet his eye for detail was extraordinary. He recorded everything: the words for water and fire in Patagonian, the sexual customs of Philippine islanders, the exact symptoms of scurvy, the flavor of penguin meat. His journal is part travelogue, part scientific notebook, part hagiography of Magellan. Meanwhile, Portuguese spies were everywhere in Seville. King Manuel had realized too late what he'd lost in Magellan. The Portuguese consul, Sebastian Alvarez, sent detailed reports on the expedition's preparations. Portuguese agents tried to sabotage the ships, cutting rigging and contaminating supplies. They spread rumors among the crew that Magellan planned to betray them all to Portugal. They offered massive bribes to key officers to desert or mutiny. One story, possibly apocryphal but revealing, tells of a Portuguese agent approaching Rui Falero with an offer: abandon the expedition, return to Portugal with his navigational secrets, and receive wealth and honors. Falero supposedly replied that he would rather sail to hell with Magellan than to heaven with King Manuel. Whether true or not, it captures the bitterness these Portuguese exiles felt toward their homeland. But Falero was becoming a problem. His mental state was deteriorating. He would lock himself in his room for days, emerging to declare that the stars predicted disaster. He accused Magellan of plotting against him, then begged forgiveness for his suspicions. He claimed to have visions of the fleet burning, of men eating each other, of islands populated by demons. The Spanish authorities began to doubt his sanity. Finally, perhaps by mutual agreement, perhaps forced by the Spanish court, Falero withdrew from the expedition. He claimed the stars told him he would die if he sailed. Magellan lost his co-commander and chief navigator, but perhaps it was for the best. Falero's instability could have caused serious problems during the voyage. He was replaced by Juan de Cartagena as second in command, a decision that would have fatal consequences. As departure approached, tensions mounted. The Portuguese increased their assassination attempts. The Spanish captains held secret meetings, discussing what to do if Magellan proved treacherous. The crew, a volatile mix of nationalities and loyalties, formed factions. The Portuguese sailors gathered around Magellan, the Spanish around their noble captains. Fights broke out in taverns. Men were stabbed in alleyways. The expedition hadn't even left port, and blood had already been spilled. On August 10th, 1519, everything was finally ready. That morning, all crew members were ordered to confession and communion at the Church of Santa Maria de la Victoria. It was a solemn moment. Many of these men would never see Spain again, and they knew it. They were sailing into the complete unknown, following a Portuguese captain most of them didn't trust, searching for a passage that might not exist. The bishop blessed the expedition. He sprinkled holy water on the ship's flags, each bearing the arms of Castile and Leon. Magellan knelt to receive a special blessing, and the bishop presented him with a royal standard, making him officially Captain General of the fleet. Cannons were fired from the ships and answered by the fortress of Seville. Crowds gathered on the riverbank to watch, some cheering, others praying, many wondering if these men were heroes or fools. But even at this moment of triumph, the discord was visible. When Magellan raised his flag on the Trinidad, the other ships were slow to acknowledge it. When he signaled for the fleet to form up, the San Antonio took its time responding. Juan de Cartagena made sure everyone saw that he considered himself Magellan's equal, not his subordinate. The rebellion had already begun. As the 5 ships sailed down the Guadalquivir toward the sea, Magellan stood on the Trinidad's castle deck, watching his fleet with satisfaction and concern in equal measure. He had achieved the impossible, convinced Spain to fund his expedition, survived Portuguese assassination attempts, assembled ships and men for the greatest voyage ever attempted. But he also knew that most of his captains wanted him dead. Half his crew suspected him of treason, and he was about to sail into waters no European had ever seen. What Magellan didn't know, what nobody could know, was the true scale of what lay ahead. He believed the Pacific Ocean was perhaps 600 leagues across, about 2,000 miles. In reality, it was over 12,000 miles at its widest point. He thought the journey would take 2 years, it would take 3, and he wouldn't live to see the end. He planned to return with holds full of spices and glory. Instead, he would die in knee-deep water, killed by warriors he thought he could easily defeat. But all that was in the future. On that August day in 1519, Ferdinand Magellan was at the height of his powers. The rejected Portuguese noble had become a Spanish knight. The man King Manuel dismissed had been given command of a fleet. The limping veteran would attempt what no one had done before, sail west to reach the east, prove the world was round not by theory but by sail and courage. The fleet took a month to reach the open Atlantic, stopping at Sanlúcar de Barrameda at the mouth of the Guadalquivir to take on final supplies. Here, more crew joined, bringing the total to its final number. Here, too, final letters were written, final confessions made, final prayers offered. Some men deserted at the last moment, their courage failing. Others tried to join, begging for a place on what they saw as a glorious adventure. On September 20th, 1519, the 5 ships left Sanlúcar and entered the open Atlantic. Pigafetta wrote, "We departed from the said port, sailing toward the southwest, and commenced our voyage which would bring us things never before seen or recorded." He had no idea how true those words would prove to be. The age of comfortable coastal sailing was over. Now began the real journey into the unknown. The first crisis came immediately. That very first evening, as protocol demanded, the 4 other ships were supposed to report to the flagship with the formal greeting. "God save you, Captain General and Master and good ship's company." It was a naval tradition, a recognition of command structure, a daily renewal of loyalty. But when the San Antonio pulled alongside the Trinidad, Juan de Cartagena had the ship's master call out differently. "God save you, Captain and Master and good ship's company." Not Captain General. Just Captain. It was a calculated insult, suggesting Magellan was merely one captain among 5, not the supreme commander. The slight might seem trivial, but at sea such details mattered immensely. If Magellan let it pass, his authority would erode day by day until he commanded nothing but his own ship. For 3 nights, Magellan said nothing. He watched, he waited, he planned. The Portuguese officers urged him to act immediately, to assert his authority before it was too late. But Magellan knew that striking too soon, too harshly, would unite the Spanish captains against him. He needed them to make a clear, undeniable breach of discipline that would justify severe response. On the 4th night, He sent Gonzalo de Espinosa, his master-at-arms and most trusted enforcer, to the San Antonio with a message: use the proper greeting or face the consequences. Cartagena's response was breathtaking in its arrogance. He not only refused, but stopped greeting the flagship altogether. The San Antonio would sail past without acknowledgement, as if the Trinidad didn't exist. The tension spread through the fleet like a contagion. Sailors on different ships began taking sides. The Portuguese backed Magellan, the Spanish supported their noble captains. Men who had been friendly in Seville now glared at each other across the water. At night, when the ships drew close enough for voices to carry, insults flew between crews. "Portuguese dog! Spanish pig!" The unity necessary for such a dangerous voyage was fracturing before they'd even left familiar waters. The fleet continued south along the African coast, but now every decision Magellan made was questioned by the Spanish captains. When he ordered a course change to catch favorable winds, they demanded explanations. When he rationed water, they accused him of hoarding the best supplies for his Portuguese crew. When he decided to follow the Brazilian current west rather than the traditional route around Africa, they openly speculated that he was lost or leading them into a trap. The breaking point came in late November 1519. For 3 weeks, the ships had been becalmed off the African coast, sitting motionless under a brutal sun. The little fresh food they carried had rotted. The wine was turning to vinegar in the heat. The water barrels were growing green slime. Men were beginning to mutter that God was punishing them for following a Portuguese trader. Some whispered about throwing Magellan overboard and sailing home. Then came the storms. Pigafetta, who had never experienced an Atlantic tempest, was terrified. During those storms, the holy body of St. Elmo appeared to us many times in light on a dark night with such brightness that it seemed like a burning torch on the maintop, where it stayed for a space of 2 hours or more, to our consolation, for we were weeping, expecting only the hour of death. And when that holy light was about to leave us, so dazzling was the brightness that it cast into our eyes, that we all remained for more than an eighth of an hour blinded and calling for mercy. This was actually an electrical phenomenon, St. Elmo's fire, caused by ionization of air during thunderstorms. But to the sailors, it was divine intervention. The appearance of the saint's fire meant they would survive the storm. Men fell to their knees on the soaking deck, praying and weeping. When the storm passed, they found themselves driven far off course, heading toward Brazil instead of rounding Africa. This wasn't necessarily bad. The Brazilian current would help them south, but Cartagena saw an opportunity. He demanded Magellan explain this new course. Why were they heading west when they should go south? What was Magellan hiding? Was he taking them to some secret Portuguese base? The questions came during a meeting of all captains aboard the Trinidad, in front of the other officers. It was a direct challenge to Magellan's authority. Magellan stood slowly. The cabin was cramped, hot, and tense. Present were all 5 captains plus their senior officers, about 20 men total. The Spanish outnumbered the Portuguese 3-1. Many had hands on their sword hilts. Violence seemed seconds away. "You will follow the flag by day and the lantern by night," Magellan said quietly. "That is all you need to know." Cartagena exploded. He accused Magellan of endangering the fleet, of being incompetent, of being a Portuguese spy. His voice rose to a shout, spittle flying. The Spanish officers watched carefully. Would they support their countryman or the Portuguese commander? Magellan raised his hand. It was a small gesture, but everyone knew what it meant. The door burst open. Gonzalo de Espinosa and a dozen armed sailors rushed in, weapons drawn. They had been waiting for the signal. In seconds, they had Cartagena surrounded. "Rebel, in the name of the king, you are my prisoner," Magellan shouted. Cartagena turned to the other Spanish captains, expecting support. They did nothing. They weren't ready to rebel, not yet. The evidence of insubordination was too clear. Cartagena had publicly challenged the Captain General's authority. By the laws of the sea, Magellan had every right to arrest him, even execute him. But Magellan was too clever to make Cartagena a martyr. Instead of putting him in chains, which would inflame the Spanish crew, he gave him to the custody of Luis de Mendoza, captain of the Victoria. It was a brilliant political move. Mendoza became responsible for Cartagena, implicated in whatever happened next. If Cartagena escaped or caused trouble, Mendoza would share the blame. With Cartagena neutralized, Magellan appointed Antonio de Coca, a Portuguese, as the new captain of the San Antonio. The Spanish crew seethed, but Magellan had won the first round. The fleet continued south along the Brazilian coast. On December 13, 1519, they reached the Bay of Rio de Janeiro, called by the natives Guanabara, meaning arm of the sea. What they found there was paradise, at least compared to what they'd endured. The bay was enormous, surrounded by lush green mountains. Fresh water poured from numerous rivers. The forests were full of strange fruits, colorful birds, and game. Most importantly, the natives were friendly and eager to trade. These were the Tupinamba people, tall and strong, their bodies painted with intricate designs. They had never seen Europeans before, and their reaction fascinated Pigafetta. When they saw us, they thought the small boats were the children of the ships, which the ships gave birth to when the boats were lowered into the water. And when the boats went alongside the ships, they thought the ships were nursing them. The natives' worldview was so different from European conception that communication was almost impossible, even with gestures. They thought the Europeans were from the sky because they saw the sailors raising and lowering sails and assumed they were wings. When Magellan's men fired muskets, the natives believed they were gods commanding thunder. Trade was easy and profitable. For a small knife, the natives would give 5 or 6 chickens. For a comb, several fish. For a small mirror, enough food to feed 10 men. For a playing card, the king from a deck, they would give 5 fowls, thinking they were receiving something magical. But what amazed the Europeans most was the natives' casual attitude toward sex and violence. Pigafetta, with his typical directness, recorded, "The women go naked as the men and are very beautiful. They offered their daughters to us, but not their wives. The women are as tall as the men and well-proportioned. They eat human flesh, but only that of their enemies. They do not eat it because it is good, but because it is a certain ceremony and custom." This was the Europeans' first encounter with ritual cannibalism, and it horrified and fascinated them in equal measure. The Tupinamba would capture enemies in war, keep them as slaves sometimes for years, then kill and eat them in elaborate ceremonies. They believed that by consuming their enemies, they absorbed their strength and courage. To the Christians, this was absolute proof of the natives' need for salvation. Magellan, deeply religious, was appalled by what he saw as satanic practices. When some sailors tried to trade with native women for sex, he had them flogged publicly. He was determined that this expedition would spread Christianity, not corruption. He organized prayers on the beach, had a large cross erected on the highest hill, and tried to explain the gospel through gestures and drawings. But not everything in Rio was peaceful. One day, a sailor named Antonio Fernandez went ashore alone, probably to meet a native woman. He never returned. Search parties found no trace of him. Had he been killed, eaten, or had he decided paradise was better than the uncertainty of Magellan's voyage? They never found out, but his disappearance reminded everyone that this beautiful land held dangers they didn't understand. After 2 weeks in Rio, restocking water and food, the fleet continued south. By January 1520, they reached the massive estuary of the River Plate between modern Argentina and Uruguay. The opening was so wide, over 100 miles, that Magellan's heart soared. Surely this was it, the passage to the other sea. For 3 weeks they explored every inlet, every channel, but it was just a river, not a strait. The disappointment was crushing. Some of the Spanish sailors began saying what many were thinking. Magellan was chasing fantasies. There was no passage. Columbus had been right that you could sail west to reach the east, but wrong about finding a way through the Americas. The continents were solid, unbroken. They should turn back, report what they'd found, and let someone else waste their lives on impossible dreams. But Magellan refused to give up. He had staked everything on this voyage: his reputation, his honor, his relationship with God. He had betrayed his homeland, alienated his crew, and sailed further south than any European expedition. He would find the passage or die trying. So they continued south into increasingly hostile waters. As they sailed further from the equator, summer was ending in the southern hemisphere. The days grew shorter and colder. Icy winds cut through their thin tropical clothing. The seas turned gray and violent. On March 31st, 1520, they reached a desolate bay at 49 degrees south latitude, further south than any European had sailed. Magellan decided to winter here in what he called Port St. Julian. It was a terrible place. The land was barren, frozen, seemingly lifeless. The wind never stopped howling. Ice formed on the rigging every night. The only creatures were penguins, which the sailors had never seen before. Pigafetta described them with his characteristic precision. These birds are black and white and have feathers over their whole body of the same size and fashion. They do not fly and live on fish. They were so fat that we did not pluck them but skinned them, and they have a beak like a crow's. The men called them geese at first, not having a word for these strange, upright-walking birds. They tasted fishy and oily, but after months of salted meat and moldy biscuit, fresh protein was welcome. The sailors also found sea lions, which they called sea wolves, and guanacos, a kind of llama, which provided meat and fur for clothing. As winter deepened, Magellan made a decision that would trigger disaster. He cut the crew's rations. They were already on reduced food. Now they would get even less, 1.5 pounds of biscuit per day, a pint of water, and minimal wine. The biscuits were full of worms and rat droppings. The water was yellow and stank. The wine had turned sour. And now they would get less of even these miserable supplies. The timing couldn't have been worse. The men were cold, exhausted, and increasingly convinced they would die in this frozen wasteland. They had been gone 8 months with nothing to show for it. No gold, no spices, no passage to the Pacific. Just death, disappointment, and a Portuguese captain who seemed to care more about his obsession than their lives. On the night of April 1st, 1520, Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, the mutiny began. It was carefully planned and nearly successful. Juan de Elcano, the master of the San Antonio, led 30 armed men through the darkness to the Victoria. They knew Luis de Mendoza, the captain, was sympathetic to their cause. They also knew Cartagena was aboard, still technically under arrest but ready to lead. The mutineers overwhelmed the watch and burst into Mendoza's cabin, but Mendoza was already part of the plot. Together, they released Cartagena, who immediately took command. By dawn, 3 of the 5 ships were in rebel hands, the San Antonio, Victoria, and Concepcion. Only Magellan's Trinidad and the small Santiago under Juan Cerro remained loyal. The mutineers sent a boat to the Trinidad with their demands. They wanted full rations restored, fair treatment of Spanish sailors, and shared command between Magellan and the Spanish captains. They didn't want to abandon the expedition, they claimed, just to ensure it was run fairly. If Magellan agreed, they would continue to serve. If not, they would sail home and report his incompetence to the king. It was checkmate, or so it seemed. The 3 rebel ships had more men, more guns, more supplies. They controlled the bay's entrance. Magellan was trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. Any conventional military analysis would have concluded his position was hopeless. But the mutineers had underestimated Ferdinand Magellan. He had survived Portuguese court politics, Moroccan battlefields, and Malaysian pirates. He had not sailed halfway around the world to be defeated by what he saw as spoiled Spanish nobles. His response was swift, brutal, and brilliant. He sent a small boat to the Victoria with a letter for Captain Mendoza, saying he wanted to negotiate. The boat carried 6 men led by Gonzalo de Espinosa. Hidden under their cloaks were daggers. When they boarded the Victoria, Mendoza was reading Magellan's letter, which was deliberately long and complex, requiring concentration. As Mendoza puzzled over the Latin phrases, Espinosa stepped behind him, grabbed his hair, and cut his throat. The violence was so sudden, so unexpected, that Mendoza's men froze. Blood spurted across the cabin, and Mendoza collapsed, gurgling and grasping at his open throat. Espinosa shouted, "In the name of the king and Magellan, anyone who moves dies." The loyal sailors who had accompanied him drew their weapons. Within minutes, through shock and speed, they had control of the Victoria. Now Magellan had 3 ships to the mutineers too. More importantly, he had momentum. He positioned the Trinidad, Santiago, and Victoria to block the harbor entrance. The rebels were trapped. When the San Antonio tried to escape that night, it ran aground on a sandbar. Its crew, realizing their position was hopeless, surrendered immediately. The Concepcion, now alone and outnumbered, gave up without a fight. The mutiny that had seemed so certain of success had collapsed in less than 24 hours. Now came the reckoning, and Magellan would make an example that would prevent any future rebellions. Mendoza was already dead, but Magellan had his body drawn and quartered anyway. Gaspar de Quesada, captain of the Concepcion, was tried and sentenced to death. But here Magellan showed cruel cleverness. Quesada's servant, Luis de Molino, was also condemned. Magellan offered Molino a deal. Execute your master, and you'll be pardoned. On April 7, 1520, on the frozen beach of Port St. Julian, Molino beheaded Quesada with an axe. Both bodies, Mendoza's and Quesada's, were drawn and quartered, their pieces displayed on stakes along the shore. 40 men had actively participated in the mutiny. By law, all should have been executed. But Magellan needed them to sail the ships. He pardoned all but 2. Juan de Cartagena, the instigator, and Pedro Sanchez de la Reina, a priest who had blessed the mutineers, received a different punishment. They would be marooned, abandoned on that frozen shore when the fleet departed. It was effectively a death sentence, but one that didn't require Magellan to spill their blood directly. For weeks after the mutiny, the quartered bodies remained on display, freezing in the Antarctic cold, a reminder of the price of rebellion. The men went about their duties in silence, trying not to look at the grotesque monuments to Magellan's authority. Some wondered if they were following a madman. Others admired his ruthless efficiency. All feared him now, which was exactly what he intended. During the long, dark winter at Port St. Julian, something remarkable happened that would enter legend. Giants appeared. At least, that's what the Europeans thought they were. Pigafetta described the first encounter. One day we suddenly saw a naked man of giant stature on the shore of the harbor, dancing, singing, and throwing dust on his head. The captain sent one of our men to the giant so that he might perform the same actions as a sign of peace. Having done that, the man led the giant to the captain. When the giant was in the captain's and our presence, he marveled greatly and made signs with one finger raised upward, believing we had come from heaven. This man stood nearly 8 feet tall, according to Pigafetta. His face was painted red with yellow circles around his eyes. His feet were wrapped in guanaco skins stuffed with straw, making them look enormous. Magellan called them Patagones, meaning big feet, which is why the region is still called Patagonia. Modern historians believe these were the Tehuelche people, who were indeed tall, averaging about 6 feet, but not giants. In the isolation and fear of that Antarctic winter, everything seemed exaggerated. The Europeans, many of whom were relatively short by modern standards, saw these tall, powerfully built people as monsters from mythology. The Tehuelche were nomadic hunters who followed guanaco herds across the frozen plains. They used every part of the animals they killed: meat for food, blood for paint, bones for tools, skins for clothing and shelter. They were fascinated by the Europeans' metal and mirrors, having never seen such materials. A small knife was a treasure beyond measure to people who made tools from stone. Magellan tried to kidnap 2 of these giants to bring back to Spain as proof of his discoveries. His method was both clever and cruel. He gave them many gifts, beads, mirrors, bells, until their hands were full. Then he showed them iron shackles, pretending they were jewelry. The trusting men held out their ankles, and Magellan's men snapped the shackles shut. The betrayal was complete. The giants roared with rage and fear, calling on their god, Setebos, for help. One managed to escape despite the shackles, running with incredible speed across the frozen ground. The other was dragged aboard ship. He refused all food, sitting in chains, staring at his captors with a mixture of hatred and incomprehension. Within weeks he was dead, whether from starvation, disease, or despair. Pigafetta doesn't say. This incident reveals something important about Magellan's character. He could be kind to his men, generous to those who served him loyally, deeply concerned with spreading Christianity. But he could also be casually cruel to those he saw as less than human. The Patagonian giants were curiosities to him, not people. Their betrayal and suffering meant nothing compared to the glory of bringing exotic specimens back to Spain. As winter dragged on, discipline began to break down despite the threat of execution. Men were dying of cold and disease. Scurvy appeared, though not yet in its worst form. Fights broke out over trivial matters, a gambling debt, an insult, a stolen ration. One man stabbed another over a pair of boots. The killer was hanged, his body left swinging in the frozen wind as another reminder of Magellan's justice. In May, Magellan sent the Santiago south to scout for the passage. The smallest of the 5 ships, commanded by Juan Cerro, fought through increasingly violent seas. The further south they went, the worse conditions became. Waves towered above the small ship. Ice coated everything. The wind was so strong that men had to crawl along the deck to avoid being blown overboard. Then, disaster struck. A storm drove the Santiago onto rocks near the mouth of what's now the Santa Cruz River. The ship broke apart in minutes. Miraculously, all but one of the 37 crew members survived, struggling through freezing surf to reach shore. But now they faced a different death, stranded on a frozen coast hundreds of miles from Port St. Julian with no food or shelter. Cerrone took charge. They built rough shelters from wreckage and seal skins. They ate shellfish, seaweed, and the occasional seal they could kill. 2 men, the strongest, volunteered to walk back to Port St. Julian for help. It took them 2 months to cover 60 miles, arriving more dead than alive, their feet blackened with frostbite, barely able to speak. Magellan immediately sent a rescue mission. When they finally brought the Santiago survivors back, they were skeletal, clothed in stinking seal skins, some unable to walk. Several had lost toes to frostbite. All were traumatized by their ordeal. The loss of the Santiago meant Magellan now had only 4 ships for a voyage planned for 5. He redistributed the crews and supplies, but everyone knew their margin for error had shrunk dangerously. On August 24, 1520, after 5 months at Port St. Julian, Magellan ordered the fleet south. But first, he had to deal with Cartagena and the priest. They were brought to the beach with a sword, some wine, and bread, enough to survive a few days, maybe weeks if they were clever. Cartagena begged for mercy, promised absolute loyalty, offered to serve as a common sailor. The priest said nothing, perhaps resigned to God's will. As the ship sailed away, the 2 marooned men stood on the frozen beach, watching their only hope of survival disappear over the horizon. Some sailors reported seeing them fall to their knees in prayer. Others said they ran along the shore, screaming. Whatever the truth, they were never seen again. Months later, when other Spanish ships visited Port St. Julian, they found no trace of them. The Patagonian winter had claimed them, as Magellan knew it would. The fleet continued south, fighting increasingly terrible conditions. At the Santa Cruz River, they stopped for 2 months to rest and resupply. Here, they found abundant fish and seals. The men regained some strength, but morale was low. They had been gone over a year, found no passage, lost a ship, and executed their comrades. Some openly said they should turn back while they still could. On October 18th, they rounded a cape and saw something that made their hearts race, an opening in the coast. Not a river mouth or bay, but a genuine strait leading west. Magellan sent the San Antonio and Concepcion to investigate, while he waited with the Trinidad and Victoria. For 5 days, there was no word. Magellan began to fear he'd lost 2 more ships. Then, on the horizon, sails appeared. The San Antonio and Concepcion were returning, flags flying, cannons firing in celebration. They had found salt water on the other side. This was it. The passage existed. After more than a year of searching, after mutiny and death and frozen hell, they had found the strait to the Pacific. What they had found would later be called the Strait of Magellan, 350 miles of the most dangerous water on Earth. The strait twisted and turned through a maze of channels, some dead ends, others leading to open ocean. The winds could reach 100 miles per hour without warning. The currents were unpredictable and violent. Glaciers loomed overhead, occasionally calving icebergs the size of buildings. Even today, with modern navigation and engines, ships avoid it when possible. For 38 days, they fought through this maritime nightmare. The channel was so narrow in places that they could almost touch both sides. The water was black and moved in ways that defied understanding. Whirlpools appeared and disappeared. The tide could rise 40 feet in 6 hours, completely changing the waterway's character. At night, they saw fires burning on the southern shore, the campfires of the native people. Magellan named that land Tierra del Fuego, land of fire. The natives, probably the Yagan people, watched these strange vessels pass but never made contact. Perhaps they knew better than to approach these desperate men. The Yagan lived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, surviving on seafood and seal meat, their bodies adapted to near-freezing water. To them, the Europeans must have seemed like ghosts, pale and weak, dying from conditions the Yagan considered normal. But the real drama was happening aboard the San Antonio. The ship's pilot, Esteban Gomez, had been arguing for weeks that they should turn back. Gomes was Portuguese, like Magellan, but he hated his commander. Before the voyage, Gomes had proposed his own expedition to find a western passage, but the Spanish court chose Magellan instead. Now, watching their supplies dwindle in this frozen hell, Gomes convinced himself and others that Magellan was leading them to certain death. "Look at our situation," Gomez argued to anyone who would listen. "We've been gone 15 months. We've lost one ship already. We're running out of food. And now we're entering an ocean nobody has ever crossed. How big is it? How long will it take? Magellan doesn't know. He's guessing. He'll kill us all for his pride." The Spanish sailors on the San Antonio listened. They remembered their executed captains, their marooned comrades, the quarters bodies displayed on stakes. On the night of November 8th, as the ships anchored in a wider part of the strait, Gomes made his move. He and several conspirators seized Alvaro de Mesquita, Magellan's cousin who commanded the San Antonio. They put him in chains and turned the ship around. Deserting through the strait at night was insanely dangerous, but they managed it, driven by desperation. By morning, the San Antonio had vanished. Magellan initially thought they were lost or exploring a side channel. He sent boats to search, had cannons fired as signals, left markers with buried messages. He waited precious days, burning through supplies. Finally, he had to accept the truth. The San Antonio had deserted. This was catastrophic. The San Antonio carried most of the expedition's food. Without it, they had provisions for 3 months, maybe 4, with strict rationing. Some officers urged Magellan to turn back. They had found the strait. That was achievement enough. They could return to Spain, resupply, and complete the voyage later. But Magellan refused. He knew if he returned now, he would never get another chance. The Spanish court would give command to someone else, probably a Spaniard. His name would be a footnote. The Portuguese who found the strait, but lacked courage to continue. He would rather die than accept that humiliation. He called together all remaining officers and made them swear on the Bible to follow him no matter what happened. On November 28, 1520, after 38 days in the strait, 3 ships emerged into a calm, vast ocean. The men wept with relief and joy. They had done it. They had found the passage from the Atlantic to the Western Sea. Magellan also wept, but for different reasons. He knew what the others didn't. They were about to cross the largest ocean on Earth with barely enough food to survive. He named this ocean the Pacific, the peaceful one, because after the violence of the strait, it seemed calm. This would prove to be cruelly ironic. The Pacific would indeed be peaceful and empty and endless, a blue desert that would nearly kill them all. On that first day in the Pacific, November 28, 1520, Magellan gathered all pilots and officers for a ceremony. Standing on the Trinidad's deck, with the vast ocean stretching endlessly before them, he made them swear an oath on a crucifix. They would follow him wherever he led, never question his navigation, obey absolutely until death. Some historians believe Magellan knew the ocean was far larger than he'd told anyone and was preparing them psychologically for the ordeal ahead. The 3 ships, Trinidad, Victoria, and Concepcion, formed a line to cover more area searching for land. During the day, they communicated with flags. At night, the Trinidad carried a torch so the others could follow. They sailed north along the Chilean coast for 2 weeks, letting the trade winds fill their sails, then turned northwest into the open ocean. What followed was one of the most horrific passages in maritime history. Magellan had told his men the ocean was perhaps 600 leagues across, about 2,000 miles. In reality, they would sail over 7,000 miles before finding inhabited land. For 98 days, they would see nothing but water and sky, an endless blue void that drove men mad. December passed without sight of land. The ocean was impossibly vast, extending to every horizon like a liquid desert. The sun blazed down, turning the deck into a furnace. The tar between planks melted and stuck to bare feet. There was no rain, so they couldn't refill their water casks. The little water they had turned green and thick with algae. Pigafetta described it with his usual precision. We drank water that had turned yellow and had been putrid for many days, and we ate biscuit, which was no longer biscuit but powder full of worms, for the worms had eaten the good. It stank strongly of the urine of rats. The rats! The ships were infested with them, and as food ran out, these vermin became valuable. Pigafetta recorded, "We ate the rats, which were sold for half a ducato apiece, and even so we could not always get them." Half a ducato was a fortune for a common sailor, several months' wages. But starving men would pay anything for meat, even rat meat. The rats were skinned, gutted, and roasted over small fires. Men fought over the carcasses, sucking the bones for every bit of nutrition. By January 1521, scurvy appeared in its full horror. It started subtly: fatigue, aching joints, irritability. Then the gums began to swell and bleed. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds reopened and wouldn't heal. Some men's legs swelled so badly they couldn't walk. The skin developed purple spots that turned black. But the worst symptom was what happened to the mouth. The gums would swell so much they grew over the teeth, making it impossible to eat even if food was available. These men died in agony, starving with their mouths sealed shut by their own rotting flesh. Pigafetta, one of the few who didn't develop severe scurvy, described the suffering. "Of all our misfortunes, this was the worst. The gums of some of our men swelled over their teeth, both upper and lower, so they could not eat and thus died. 19 men died from this sickness, and the giant we had captured, as well as an Indian from Brazil." The reference to the giant and the Brazilian Indian reminds us that this wasn't just a European tragedy. Magellan had brought captives and recruits from their stops, and they died just as horribly as the Spanish and Portuguese sailors. Their deaths went mostly unrecorded, footnotes in a larger tragedy. As the biscuits ran out completely, the men turned to eating leather. These were the ox hides used to protect the rigging from chafing, soaked in salt water for months, hardened by sun and rain until they were like eating shoes. Pigafetta described the process. "We ate the ox hides that covered the main yard to prevent the yard from chafing the shrouds. They were very hard because of the sun, rain, and wind. We soaked them in the sea for 4 or 5 days, then placed them for a short time over the embers, and so we ate them." Think about that for a moment. They were so desperate they were eating leather that had been used as ship equipment, soaked in seawater, not fresh water, they had none, to soften it slightly, then charred over fire to kill the worst of the rot, then chewed with mouths destroyed by scurvy. It provided almost no nutrition, just something to fill the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. Some men ate sawdust from the ship's carpenter shop. It was wood dust, providing no nutrition, just bulk to stop the hunger pains for a few hours. Others caught and ate the large maggots that bred in the rotting supplies. These were considered a delicacy, fresh protein, even if it came from decay. Men would search through the spoiled biscuit barrels, picking out the fat white grubs and eating them alive before someone else could claim them. The psychological torture was as bad as the physical. Day after day, nothing but ocean. The horizon never changed. Some men became convinced they had sailed off the edge of the world and were now in some kind of maritime purgatory, doomed to sail forever. Others thought they were already dead, that this was hell, an endless ocean under a burning sun, dying slowly while unable to die completely. Men began to hallucinate. They saw islands that weren't there, ships that vanished when approached, their dead comrades walking on water. One sailor became convinced that if he could just swim far enough, he would find land. He jumped overboard and swam toward the horizon until he disappeared. Others had to be tied down to prevent them from following. The religious became fanatical, praying constantly, seeing divine messages in cloud formations and wave patterns. The irreligious cursed God, Magellan, and their own stupidity for joining this doomed voyage. Fights broke out over nothing, a perceived insult, a missing ration, a space on deck in the shade. Men who had been friends tried to kill each other over a captured rat. Magellan himself seemed to exist in a different reality. While his men starved and despaired, he maintained iron discipline. He still took celestial observations every clear night, still kept detailed logs, still insisted on proper naval protocol. Every evening, the ships would close for prayers. Magellan would lead them, his voice carrying across the water, asking God for deliverance, while his men wondered if God was listening or if he had abandoned them to die in this endless ocean. What sustained Magellan was his absolute conviction that God had chosen him for this mission. This wasn't just exploration, it was divine mandate. Every death, every day of suffering was part of God's plan. They would reach the Spice Islands because God willed it. They would spread Christianity to lands that had never heard of Christ. The suffering was a test of faith. Those who died had simply failed the test. This religious mania extended to his treatment of the crew. When men were caught stealing food, even a handful of worm-infested biscuit powder, Magellan had them flogged. When some sailors suggested they might find food by returning to Chile, he accused them of cowardice and lack of faith. He seemed to believe that suffering purified the soul, that their ordeal was making them worthy of the great discovery ahead. Meanwhile, Magellan was making scientific observations that would outlive them all. He discovered and named the Magellanic Clouds, 2 galaxies visible in the southern hemisphere. He noted that the Southern Cross constellation could be used for navigation like the North Star. He recorded ocean currents, wind patterns, and the changing positions of unfamiliar stars. Even as his expedition died around him, he was adding to human knowledge. On January 24th, 1521, after 58 days at sea, they saw land. A small island uninhabited, but land nonetheless. The men screamed, wept, fell to their knees in prayer. But as they approached, their joy turned to despair. The island was a bare rock with no water, no trees, no food, nothing but seabirds that flew away as they approached. They couldn't even anchor, the water was too deep. They named it San Pablo Island, and it exists today as Puka Puka in the Tuamotu archipelago. 2 weeks later, another island, equally useless. They were in an ocean dotted with tiny atolls that offered nothing but false hope. The men began to despair completely. They were in a vast ocean sprinkled with useless rocks. They would die of thirst while surrounded by water, starve while birds flew overhead, always out of reach. By late February, the situation was beyond desperate. 19 men had died of scurvy and starvation. The survivors were skeletal, covered in sores, many unable to stand. Some couldn't open their eyes because their eyelids had swollen shut. The ships themselves were falling apart. Without proper maintenance, the rigging was failing. Sails tore and couldn't be repaired because the men were too weak. The hulls leaked, and pumping out water was exhausting work for starving men. They had now been at sea for over 90 days. Magellan's promised few weeks to cross the ocean had turned into 3 months of horror. Even he must have known by now that he had catastrophically miscalculated. The ocean was vast beyond imagination. But still, he showed no doubt, no weakness. Every evening he led prayers. Every morning he took observations. He was either the strongest man alive or completely insane. Perhaps both. On March 6, 1521, after 98 days without seeing inhabited land, after crossing over 7,000 miles of empty ocean, a lookout croaked out the word everyone had given up hoping to hear. Tierra! Tierra! Land, real land, mountains covered in green forests, beaches with smoke from fires, people, food, water, salvation. As they approached these islands, which we now know as Guam and the Marianas, outrigger canoes swarmed toward them. The natives, Chamorro people, had never seen European ships before. They climbed aboard fearlessly, marveling at everything. And then they began taking things, everything they could carry, rope, tools, metal, even a small boat tied to the Trinidad. To the Chamorros, this wasn't theft. In their culture, property was communal. These strangers had arrived in their waters, so everything became shared. But to the Europeans, dying and desperate, it was intolerable. When natives took the skiff from the Trinidad, Magellan snapped. He ordered a raiding party ashore with crossbows and guns. What followed was a massacre. The Europeans burned 40 houses and killed 7 people. The natives fled in terror, having never experienced European weapons. The sailors took everything they could find: pigs, chickens, fish, fruit, vegetables, and most importantly, fresh water. They gorged themselves on fresh food, some eating so much so fast that they vomited and had to start again. For 3 days, the Europeans recovered in Guam. Men who had been dying began to walk again. The swelling went down, the sores began to heal. Fresh fruit and vegetables, we now know, contain vitamin C that cures scurvy. They didn't understand the science, but they knew that fresh food brought them back from death's edge. Pigafetta gives us a description of the Chamorro people that reveals both fascination and casual racism. Those people are poor, but ingenious and very thievish, on account of which we called those 3 islands the Islands of Thieves. They ride in boats called proas, which are like gondolas but narrower. Some are black, some white, and the rest red. On the opposite side of the sail, they have a large piece of wood pointed at the top, with poles laid across and resting on the water so that the boats cannot capsize. They sail as fast as the wind. The proas amazed the Europeans. These outrigger canoes could sail faster than their heavy ships, and the natives handled them with incredible skill. They could literally sail them backward, switching bow and stern instantly. The Chamorros had been sailing these waters for over 3,000 years, their navigation skills far exceeding the Europeans in some ways. They could find tiny islands using wave patterns, bird flights, and subtle changes in watercolor. On March 9th, they left Guam, the natives following in their proas, shouting and throwing stones but staying out of crossbow range. The Europeans were stronger now but far from recovered. Many still had scurvy that would take weeks to fully heal. They were entering unknown waters, approaching lands no European had seen. They sailed west through what we now call the Philippines, though, of course, they had no name for this archipelago yet. A week later, they reached the island of Homenhon, uninhabited but with fresh water and coconut palms. Here, Magellan allowed the men to truly rest and recover. They built shelters on the beach and brought the sickest ashore. Fresh air, solid ground, and proper food began working miracles. Men who had been dying started to laugh again. The swelling went down, teeth stopped falling out, old wounds finally began healing properly. It was here that Enrique, Magellan's slave, became crucial. As they sailed through these islands, they began encountering people in canoes. Magellan had Enrique speak to them in Malay, the language he had learned in Malacca. To everyone's amazement, the natives understood him. Not perfectly, but enough to communicate. Think about what this meant. They had sailed west from Spain, across the Atlantic, through South America, across the Pacific, and now Enrique could speak to the locals. They were approaching the world Magellan knew from his years in the Portuguese East. The circle was closing. If these people spoke Malay, the Spice Islands couldn't be far. On March 28th, they reached the island of Limasawa. Here occurred one of the most significant meetings of the voyage. The local ruler, Raja Colombo, came aboard the Trinidad. He was a small man, elaborately tattooed, wearing silk clothes and gold jewelry. Through Enrique's translation, Magellan explained they served the greatest king in the world and were exploring these islands. Colombo was impressed by their weapons, their ships, their strange pale appearance. The meeting began with careful diplomacy. Colombo brought gifts: fish, palm wine, bananas, and coconuts. Magellan reciprocated with cloth, mirrors, combs, and bells. Then Colombo did something that amazed the Europeans. He cut his palm, let blood drip into a cup of palm wine, and drank half, offering the rest to Magellan. It was a blood oath, making them brothers. Magellan, after a moment's hesitation, drank. They were now family by local custom. What followed was a feast that Pigafetta describes in wonderful detail. They sat on bamboo mats while servants brought course after course: roasted fish, rice cooked in leaves, turtle eggs, palm wine served in coconut shells. The Raja ate from golden plates and drank from golden cups. This excited the Spanish tremendously. Gold meant wealth, meant this voyage might yet make them rich. The palm wine, which the locals called arak, was potent. Pigafetta describes the elaborate ritual of drinking. When the king wished to drink, he would raise his hands to heaven, then extend his right hand toward us, making a fist with only the thumb extended. At first, we thought he was going to strike us, but then we understood this was how they drank. Everyone would shout, "Sala," and drink. But for Magellan, something else was more important than gold or ceremony. On Easter Sunday, March 31st, 1521, he organized the first Catholic Mass in the Philippines. He had a cross erected on the highest hill of Limasawa. The entire crew attended in their best remaining clothes, ragged and patched but clean. Colombo and his people watched this strange ceremony with fascination. When the Spanish fired their guns in celebration after Mass, the natives fell to the ground in terror. Magellan quickly reassured them it was meant as honor, not threat. He explained through Enrique that they worshipped one God who created everything. This God had a son who died to save humanity. If Colombo and his people accepted this God, they would have eternal life in paradise. Colombo was interested but cautious. His people had their own gods, their own ancestors to worship, but he was also practical. These strangers had weapons that could kill from a distance, ships larger than any vessel he'd seen, and goods that seemed magical. If their God was as powerful as their weapons, perhaps it was worth considering. But Colombo told them about a greater chief, Raja Humabon of Cebu. If Magellan wanted to establish a presence in these islands, Cebu was the place. Humabon controlled extensive territories and commanded many warriors. On April 3rd, the three ships left Limasawa with some of Colombo's men as guides. As they sailed toward Cebu, they passed through waters that were paradise compared to the Pacific. Islands everywhere, each inhabited, cultivated, civilized. These weren't the barren atolls of the Pacific or the frozen wastes of Patagonia. This was a thriving maritime civilization that had existed for centuries before Europeans arrived. The Philippines, as they would later be called, were not a unified kingdom, but hundreds of independent communities, each with its own Raja or Datu. They traded with China, Borneo, Siam, and the Moluccas. They had gold, pearls, precious woods, and spices. They had writing systems, legal codes, and sophisticated boats. In many ways, they were more advanced than the Europeans who thought themselves superior. On April 7th, 1521, the three ships entered Cebu harbor. The sight that greeted them was overwhelming. Hundreds of canoes filled the water. The beaches were crowded with thousands of people. Buildings of wood and bamboo lined the shore. This was a major city, the largest they had seen since leaving Spain. Magellan ordered the ship's cannons fired as a salute. The crowd fled in panic but quickly returned when they realized it was ceremonial. The meeting with Raja Humabon began with tension. The Raja's advisors demanded tribute. Every ship that traded in Cebu paid taxes. Magellan, through Enrique, refused absolutely. They represented the King of Spain, the most powerful monarch in the world. They paid tribute to no one. In fact, if Humabon was wise, he would become a vassal of Spain and enjoy their protection. It was an audacious bluff. Magellan had 3 damaged ships and maybe 150 sick, exhausted men. Humabon commanded thousands of warriors, but Magellan had guns and psychology. He had one of his men, probably Pigafetta, dress in full armor. Then he had other men attack him with swords and spears. The weapons bounced off harmlessly. The demonstration was impressive. These strangers couldn't be killed by normal weapons. Then came the guns. Magellan had his men fire at targets on the beach, showing their range and devastating impact. The sound alone was terrifying to people who had never heard gunpowder. But Magellan was clever. After demonstrating his power, he immediately spoke of peace, friendship, and mutual benefit. He didn't want to conquer, he claimed, but to trade and spread God's word. What really won Humabon over was religion. Magellan promised that if Humabon became Christian, he would become the most powerful ruler in all the islands. God would favor him in battle. His enemies would submit. His crops would flourish. After death, he would enjoy eternal paradise. And as a sign of God's power, Magellan told of their voyage, how they had crossed the greatest ocean in the world, suffering terrible hardships. But God had preserved them to bring his word to these islands. Humabon was shrewd. He saw opportunity in these strangers. Their weapons could help him dominate rival chiefs. Their trade could make him wealthy. Their God might indeed be powerful, They had survived impossible journeys to reach his islands. But he was also cautious. He consulted his advisors, his ancestors' spirits, his own judgment. On April 14, 1521, Raja Humayun, his wife, and hundreds of their subjects were baptized. It was the culmination of Magellan's dreams. He wasn't just an explorer anymore. He was a missionary, a bringer of the true faith. Humayun took the Christian name Carlos after the Spanish king. His wife became Juana. The baptisms continued for days. Pigafetta claimed 2,200 people became Christian that week. Magellan gave Humayun's wife a special gift, a wooden statue of the Christ child, the Santo Niño. She was overwhelmed, weeping at its beauty. That same statue exists today in Cebu, the oldest Christian relic in the Philippines, still venerated by millions. It survived fires, earthquakes, wars, and centuries. Whatever we think of colonialism and forced conversion, that wooden statue represents a moment when two worlds met and were forever changed. But not everyone was happy with these changes. Some of Humayun's subjects resented abandoning their ancestors' gods. Other chiefs saw Humayun's alliance with the strangers as a threat. Most importantly, on nearby Mactan Island, a chief named Lapu-Lapu refused to submit to Humayun or convert to Christianity. Lapu-Lapu sent a message to Magellan. He would trade if they wished, but he bowed to no foreign god or king. He ruled Mactan, as his fathers had before him. These strangers were welcome as traders, but not as masters. It was a reasonable position, but to Magellan, it was intolerable. Here we see Magellan at his worst. Drunk on religious fervor and recent success, he decided to subjugate Lapu-Lapu, not because it was strategically necessary. They could have easily avoided Mactan. Not because they needed supplies. Cebu provided everything. He wanted to demonstrate Christian superiority, to show these new converts that their God would protect them in battle. Humayun tried to dissuade him. He offered 1,000 warriors to accompany the Spanish. Magellan refused. This had to be a purely Christian victory. God would protect them. 50 European soldiers with armor and guns could defeat any number of pagans. It would be a lesson to all who resisted conversion. On the night of April 26, 1521, Magellan made his final preparations. He heard confession, took communion, and prayed for victory. He selected 49 men to accompany him, leaving 11 to guard the boats. Among those left behind was Pigafetta, who had begged to join the fight but was ordered to stay and record what happened. Magellan sent a final message to Lapu-Lapu. Submit now and be spared. Resist and face annihilation. Lapu-Lapu's response was brilliant. He asked for 1 day to consider, just until morning. Magellan agreed, thinking the chief was stalling out of fear. In reality, Lapu-Lapu was preparing. He studied the Spanish armor, noticed it didn't protect the legs. He observed that muskets took long to reload. He knew the reef would prevent their boats from reaching shore. He had a plan. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 27th, the Spanish boats approached Mactan. Magellan expected to find a sleeping village. Instead, hundreds of warriors were already on the beach. Lapu-Lapu had spent the night organizing his forces, preparing defenses, motivating his men. As the boats hit the coral reef, still far from shore, Magellan realized his mistake. They would have to wade through hundreds of yards of water to reach land. The moment the Spanish entered the water, arrows and stones began falling like rain. Lapu-Lapu had instructed his men to aim for the legs, the only unprotected part. It was devastatingly effective. Spanish soldiers began falling immediately, wounded in thighs and calves, unable to continue forward or retreat quickly. The water, thigh-deep and sometimes chest-deep, made movement in armor almost impossible. Magellan ordered his crossbowmen and musketeers to return fire, but it was useless. The range was too great, the aim impossible while standing in moving water. The few bolts and bullets that reached shore did little damage. Lapu-Lapu's men used large wooden shields and kept moving, never presenting stationary targets. As Spanish soldiers fell wounded, Magellan made a desperate decision. He ordered some men to burn the village houses, hoping to create panic. A small group managed to reach outlying huts and set them ablaze. It was the worst thing he could have done. The sight of their homes burning enraged the warriors. What had been a defensive battle became a furious counterattack. Hundreds more warriors poured from the forest. They had been held in reserve, but now Lapu-Lapu committed everything. The Spanish were outnumbered at least 30 to 1, probably more. They were exhausted from wading through water in heavy armor. Their gunpowder was wet, making many muskets useless. They were scattered across the shallows, unable to form their disciplined formations that were their greatest advantage. Pigafetta, watching from the boat, described what happened next. The natives shot the captain through the right leg with a poisoned arrow, wherefore he ordered us to retire slowly, but the men fled, except 6 or 8 of us who remained with the captain. The natives shot only at our legs, for the latter were bare, and so many were the spears and stones that they hurled at us that we could offer no resistance. Magellan was wounded, but kept fighting. An arrow in his leg, blood flowing into the water, he still tried to organize a retreat. But it was chaos. Men threw away weapons to move faster. Some tried to swim despite their armor. Others stood paralyzed with fear as warriors closed in. The water turned red with blood. A warrior managed to wound Magellan's sword arm with a bamboo spear. Unable to draw his sword, Magellan was defenseless. Another warrior slashed his face. He fell to his knees in the water. Recognizing him as the leader, dozens of warriors converged on him. They struck him with spears, swords, and clubs, continuing long after he was dead, ensuring this invader would never rise again. The surviving Spanish fled to the boats in complete panic. Of the 49 who had waded ashore, 8 were killed, including Magellan. Many others were wounded. They left the bodies behind, including Magellan's. The great navigator, who had traveled further than perhaps any human in history, who had found the strait and crossed the Pacific, died in 3 feet of water for no strategic purpose whatsoever. When the survivors reached the ships and told what had happened, there was disbelief. Magellan dead? It seemed impossible. He had survived Portuguese assassins, Spanish mutineers, Antarctic storms, and Pacific starvation. How could he die in such a pointless battle against warriors using bamboo spears? The death of Magellan left the expedition in chaos. There was no clear successor. Duarte Barbosa, Magellan's brother-in-law, tried to take command, but he lacked authority. João Cerrão and João Lopes also claimed leadership. The Spanish survivors resented taking orders from any Portuguese. The expedition had lost its driving force, the iron will that had carried them across the world. Worse, their position in Cebu was now precarious. Humabon had seen the Spanish defeated. These weren't invincible warriors blessed by an all-powerful god. They were just men, and not very many of them. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. Why should he continue to protect and supply these weakened strangers? On May 1st, 1521, disaster struck again. Humabon invited the Spanish officers to a feast, claiming he had jewels to present to the King of Spain. Barbosa, Cerrão, and 27 others went ashore. Only Gonzalo de Espinosa and Juan Carvalho stayed behind, suspicious of the invitation. Their paranoia saved their lives. During the feast, armed warriors attacked. The Europeans were slaughtered. João Cerrão managed to escape to the beach, wounded and bloody, screaming for rescue. The men on the ships could see him, but were terrified of another ambush. Cerrão's own son was among the crew and begged them to save his father, but Espinosa and Carvalho, now in command, ordered the ships to sail. Cerrão's final screams haunted those who heard them. He cursed them as cowards and traitors as warriors dragged him back to certain death. The massacre reduced the expedition to 115 men, too few to properly sail 3 ships. They burned the Concepcion, transferring its supplies to the Trinidad and Victoria. 2 ships now, less than half the men who had left Spain, no clear leader, thousands of miles from home. The survivors elected Juan Carvalho as Captain General and Juan Sebastian Elcano as Captain of the Victoria. Yes, the same Elcano who had led the mutiny at Port St. Julian. The mutineer Magellan had spared, now helped lead what remained of his expedition. For the next 6 months, the 2 ships wandered through the Indonesian archipelago like lost ghosts. Without Magellan's driving purpose or Enrique's translations, the slave had disappeared in Cebu, either killed or escaped. They had no clear plan. They tried piracy, attacking local trading vessels, but gained little. They were too weak to force cooperation, too poor to trade effectively. They stopped at various islands, Bohol, Mindanao, Palawan, trading when they could, stealing when they couldn't. The men were demoralized, sick, and increasingly desperate. Some deserted whenever they reached a populated island. Why continue this cursed voyage when they could live in tropical paradise with abundant food and willing women? At Brunei, they found a sophisticated sultanate that amazed them. The city was built on stilts over water, connected by bridges and canals. The Sultan's palace was decorated with gold and Chinese porcelain. His royal barge was powered by dozens of oarsmen and decorated with precious stones. This was a civilization that traded with China, India, Siam, and Java, far wealthier and more connected than the Spanish had expected. The Sultan of Brunei received them cordially, but was clearly unimpressed. What did these dirty, desperate Europeans have to offer that Chinese merchants couldn't provide better and cheaper? He allowed them to trade, but watched them carefully. When some Spanish sailors got drunk and caused trouble, he made it clear they should leave. They did, quickly. Throughout these wanderings, disease continued to claim lives. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers killed men regularly. The ships were rotting in the tropical heat and humidity. Shipworms ate through the hulls. The rigging failed constantly. They needed a proper port for major repairs, but who would help them? They were too weak to compel assistance, too poor to pay for it. Finally, on November 8, 1521, after months of aimless wandering, they reached their original goal, the Spice Islands. Tidore, one of the tiny volcanic islands where cloves grew wild. The Sultan of Tidore, rivals with the Portuguese-allied Sultan of Ternate, welcomed them. Here at last was someone who saw value in Spanish friendship against Portuguese dominance. The Sultan helped them repair their ships and allowed them to load cloves, tons of cloves worth a fortune in Europe. The sweet smell filled the ships, a promise of wealth if they could just get home. For the first time in months, the men had hope. They had reached the Spice Islands, loaded the precious cargo. Now they just had to survive the journey home. But as they prepared to leave, the Trinidad began taking on water faster than it could be pumped out. The hull was beyond repair without proper facilities. They faced a terrible decision: wait months for repairs that might not work or split up. Gonzalo de Espinosa would stay with the Trinidad and attempt repairs, then try to sail east, back across the Pacific to Spanish America. Juan Sebastián Elcano would take the Victoria and attempt to reach Spain by continuing west through Portuguese waters. On December 21, 1521, the Victoria left Tidore with 47 Europeans and 13 East Indians aboard. The Trinidad stayed with 53 men. Most would never see Europe again. The Trinidad did eventually attempt the Pacific crossing, but was forced back by storms and contrary winds. The Portuguese captured them at Ternate. Most died in prison. Only 4 ever made it home years later. Elcano, now commanding the last ship, faced an impossible choice. The Victoria was overloaded with cloves and barely seaworthy. To reach Spain, he had to cross the Indian Ocean, round Africa, and sail the Atlantic, all through waters controlled by Portugal. If Portuguese ships caught them, it meant prison or death. Spain and Portugal weren't at war, but the Portuguese jealously guarded their spice monopoly. A Spanish ship in the Indian Ocean, loaded with cloves, would not be tolerated. So Elcano made a desperate decision. Instead of island hopping along the usual trade routes where he might find food and water, but would certainly encounter Portuguese patrols, he would sail directly across the Indian Ocean. It meant months at sea without resupply, but it was their only chance of avoiding capture. The voyage was a nightmare that rivaled the Pacific crossing. The Victoria leaked constantly. Men worked the pumps day and night just to keep afloat. The cloves, their fortune and hope, had to be thrown overboard to lighten the ship. Scurvy returned with a vengeance. They had learned nothing about preventing it, didn't understand that fresh fruit and vegetables were the cure. Again, men's teeth fell out, their gums rotted, their joints swelled. By the time they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, only rice kept them alive. Rice and determination. Every man aboard knew that if they could just reach Spain, they would be heroes. Rich heroes. They would have done what Columbus claimed but failed to do, reach the East by sailing west. They would have proved definitively that the world was round, not through theory but by sailing around it. But the Portuguese were everywhere. As the Victoria crawled up the African coast, desperate for supplies, Elcano had to avoid every port. Portuguese ships patrolled these waters constantly. They stopped at the Cape Verde Islands, Portuguese territory, pretending to be returning from the Americas. They told elaborate lies about storms and damaged masts, buying supplies with cloves hidden in false compartments. While at Cape Verde, they made a shocking discovery. By their careful count, it was Wednesday, July 9th. On shore, it was Thursday, July 10th. They had lost a day. This confused and disturbed them deeply. How could they lose a day? Had they miscounted? Was it divine punishment? They wouldn't understand until later that they had discovered what we now call the international dateline effect. By sailing west around the world, they had lost a day relative to those who stayed in one place. The Portuguese grew suspicious. These men were too desperate, their ship too damaged, their stories too inconsistent. 13 men who had gone ashore for supplies were arrested. Elcano had to abandon them and flee. The Victoria, leaking, undermanned, its rigging failing, limped toward Spain. The men were so weak they could barely work the sails. They discussed surrendering to the next ship they saw, Portuguese or not. Prison seemed better than death. But on September 6, 1522, 3 years after departing, the Victoria reached Sanlúcar de Barrameda. As they approached the Spanish coast, fishermen came out to meet them. The fishermen couldn't believe what they were seeing. This ghost ship, this handful of skeletal men, claimed to have sailed around the world. Impossible. The known world didn't work that way. 18 Europeans had survived the complete circumnavigation, 18 out of 270. As church bells rang and crowds gathered, these 18 men staggered ashore. They were skeletal, dressed in rags, many unable to walk without help. But they had done it. They had sailed west to reach the east. They had proved the world was round. They had found the strait between oceans, crossed the Pacific, and returned home. But their first act wasn't celebration. Still dressed in their rags, barefoot, skeletal, they walked in procession to the shrine of Santa Maria de la Victoria, the same church where they had prayed before departing. They had promised to make this pilgrimage if God brought them home. They kept their promise, giving thanks for surviving the impossible. The impact of their return was immediate and profound. The Portuguese were furious. Their secret routes were secret no more. The Spanish were ecstatic. They had a claim to the Spice Islands and had proved it was possible to reach them by sailing west. Geographers and cosmographers had to recalculate everything. The Pacific was vast beyond imagination. The earth was far larger than anyone had believed. Juan Sebastian Elcano was received by King Charles V and richly rewarded. He was given a coat of arms with a globe and the motto, Primus circumdedisti me. You were first to encircle me. The mutineer who had tried to overthrow Magellan was now celebrated as a hero. History loves irony. Antonio Pigafetta presented his journal to the king, then spent years traveling European courts, telling the story of the voyage. His account would become one of the most important documents in exploration history. Without it, we would know the facts, but not the experience. We wouldn't know about the giants of Patagonia, the fires of Tierra del Fuego, the endless horror of the Pacific crossing, the strange customs of Pacific Islanders. But what of Magellan's legacy? The Spanish and Portuguese argued about it for centuries. The Portuguese called him a traitor who got what he deserved. The Spanish celebrated him as a hero who had given them the Pacific. The Philippines have an even more complicated relationship with him. He brought colonization and Christianity, transformation and trauma in equal measure. The Spice Islands themselves became a source of conflict between Spain and Portugal for years. Eventually, Spain sold their claim to Portugal for 350,000 ducats. It seemed like a bad deal at the time, but Spain had discovered something better, the Philippines, which would become the jewel of their Pacific empire for 300 years. Soon, Spanish galleons would regularly sail from Acapulco to Manila and back, creating the first truly global trade network. The Victoria, the tough little ship that completed history's first circumnavigation, continued sailing for decades. It made several more voyages to the Americas before disappearing from records around 1570, probably broken up for scrap. The ship that had carried humanity around the world for the first time ended as anonymous timber in some Spanish building. The San Antonio, which had deserted in the Strait of Magellan, had made it back to Spain in May 1521. The deserters aboard told their version of events, painting Magellan as a Portuguese madman who had led Spaniards to their deaths. When the Victoria returned with the truth, there were trials, investigations, arguments that lasted years. Some of the San Antonio deserters were imprisoned. Others were pardoned. The pilot Esteban Gomez, who had led the desertion, managed to convince authorities he had acted to save Spanish lives. The 13 men arrested in Cape Verde were eventually released through diplomatic negotiations. Some made it home to find they had been declared dead, their wives remarried, their property distributed. The 4 survivors from the Trinidad who were captured by the Portuguese spent years in prison before finally returning to Spain. Their stories of attempting to recross the Pacific, of storms that threw them back, of Portuguese dungeons, added more chapters to this epic. But perhaps the most significant outcome was how the voyage changed humanity's conception of itself. Before Magellan's expedition, the world was vast, mysterious, possibly infinite. After it, the world was finite, measurable, conquerable. The psychological impact was as significant as the geographical discoveries. Humans had circled their planet. The impossible had been done. What else might be possible? The expedition had proved that all oceans connected, that there were no edges to fall off, no impassable barriers between peoples. It showed that humans lived on a single sphere floating in space, that if you traveled far enough in any direction, you would eventually return to where you started. This was no longer theory, but demonstrated fact. Within decades of Magellan's voyage, European ships were regularly crossing the Pacific. The ocean that had nearly killed Magellan's men became a highway for trade. The Manila galleons carried silver from the Americas to Asia and silk and spices back. The isolated civilizations of the Pacific were pulled into global trade networks. Diseases spread, killing millions who had no immunity. Christianity spread, sometimes by persuasion, often by force. Languages disappeared as Spanish became dominant. Magellan himself remains a contradiction. He was a genius navigator who found the strait that bears his name. He was also a religious fanatic whose zealotry led to his pointless death. He was brave to the point of recklessness, loyal to those who served him, cruel to those who opposed him. He changed the world more than almost any individual in history, yet he died achieving nothing in a battle that didn't need to be fought. In Cebu today, at the spot where Magellan supposedly planted his cross, there's a small chapel. Inside is a cross that locals claim contains fragments of Magellan's original. Whether true or not, Filipinos come to pray there, leaving offerings, lighting candles. Christianity, which Magellan brought with such violence, is now practiced by over 80% of Filipinos, transformed and adapted to local traditions. Not far away, on Mactan Island, there's a monument to Lapu-Lapu, the chief who killed Magellan. He's a national hero in the Philippines, a symbol of resistance to foreign invasion. Every April 27th, the Battle of Mactan is reenacted, with actors playing Magellan always losing to actors playing Lapu-Lapu. The crowd cheers when Magellan falls. History is written by the victors, but sometimes the losers get monuments too. The Santo Niño, the statue of the Christ child that Magellan gave to Humaban's wife, survived everything. When Spanish conquistadors returned to Cebu 44 years later, they found the city burned, Humaban's dynasty overthrown, but the statue intact in a small hut, still venerated. Today, it's housed in a basilica, the oldest Christian relic in the Philippines. Millions of Filipinos pray to it, believing it performs miracles. Whatever we think of colonization, that small wooden statue represents a moment of genuine human connection across vast cultural differences. Pigafetta's journal preserved more than just events. He recorded words and languages that would soon disappear, customs that would be suppressed, beliefs that would be forbidden. When he described the sexual practices of Pacific Islanders or the cannibalism of Brazilian natives, he was documenting worlds about to be destroyed. His non-judgmental curiosity preserved details that horrified his contemporaries but fascinate historians today. One detail from Pigafetta haunts me. During the Pacific crossing, he describes how they saw no birds for 3 months except one that had no anus. The men thought it was a bird from paradise that never landed, living its whole life in the air, feeding on dew and wind. It was probably a swallow or martin, far from any land, as lost as they were. That image, a bird that never rests, flying endlessly over an endless ocean, captures something essential about Magellan's voyage. These men had become like that bird, unable to stop, unable to rest, carried forward by forces they couldn't control. The voyage asked fundamental questions that still resonate. When worlds connect, who benefits and who suffers? When knowledge expands, what wisdom is lost? When we prove we can do something, does that mean we should? Magellan thought he was serving God in Spain. Lapu-Lapu thought he was defending his home. Both were right. Both were wrong. History doesn't offer simple morals. The greatest voyage in human history ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. 18 skeletal survivors stumbling into a church, thanking God they had lived to see home again. They had circled the globe and found it was just that, a globe, finite and measurable, spinning in infinite space. They had solved the oldest mystery and discovered the newest truth. We live on a single world, and there is no escaping each other. The expedition had cost everything. 252 lives, 5 ships, 3 years of unimaginable suffering. It had also given everything. Proof the world was round, maps of new oceans and lands, connections between civilizations that had lived in isolation for millennia. It was humanity's first global act, the moment our species became truly planetary. But what did it mean for the individuals who lived it? For the men who ate leather and sawdust, who watched their teeth fall out, who saw their comrades quartered on frozen beaches? For Magellan, dying in shallow water for a god who didn't save him. For Elcano, the mutineer who became a hero. For Pigafetta, the chronicler who recorded wonders and horrors with equal fascination. Perhaps the meaning was different for each man. For some, it was about wealth, the clothes that would make them rich. For others, it was about glory, being first to circle the world. For Magellan, it was about faith, spreading Christianity to the ends of the earth. For many, it was simply about survival, living through another day, reaching the next island, making it home. But collectively, they had done something unprecedented. They had taken the theoretical and made it real. Ancient Greeks had calculated the earth was round. Magellan's expedition proved it by sailing around it. Columbus had claimed you could reach the east by sailing west. Magellan's expedition actually did it. Every assumption about the size and shape of the world had to be recalculated based on their experience. The human cost was staggering. Not just the 252 Europeans who died, but the countless indigenous people killed by violence and disease. Not just the immediate deaths, but the long-term destruction of cultures, languages, ways of life that had existed for thousands of years. The world Magellan's expedition opened was also a world it helped destroy. Yet, it also connected humanity in ways previously impossible. After Magellan, there were no more isolated civilizations, no more peoples unknown to each other. Trade goods, ideas, diseases, technologies, and beliefs began flowing around the globe. The world became smaller and larger simultaneously. Smaller because it could be circled, larger because it contained more diversity than anyone had imagined. Today, we can fly around the world in 40 hours. Magellan's expedition took 3 years. We can communicate instantly with anyone anywhere. They spent months out of contact with all humanity. We know exactly where we are at every moment through GPS. They navigated by stars and guesswork, often lost, always uncertain. But in some ways, their achievement was greater than modern circumnavigation. They didn't know what they would find. Every day brought genuine discovery. Every island could have been populated by monsters or angels. Every stretch of ocean could have been endless. They sailed not just through space, but through imagination, transforming the unknown into the known with every league traveled. The Strait of Magellan is still considered one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth. Modern ships with engines and radar still struggle with its winds and currents. That Magellan found and navigated it with 16th century technology seems impossible. The Pacific Ocean is still vast and mostly empty. That they crossed it without dying of thirst seems miraculous. The journey they completed seems harder than traveling to the moon. At least astronauts knew where they were going. In the end, Magellan's expedition was about connection. Connecting oceans, connecting peoples, connecting ideas about what was possible. It was about proving that the theoretical could become real through human will and endurance. It was about showing that the Earth was one world, not many separate ones. For better and worse, it made globalization inevitable. The tragedy is that Magellan never knew what he had achieved. He died believing he had failed, killed in a pointless battle on an island he didn't need to conquer. He never knew that his ships had completed the circumnavigation. He never saw the impact of his discoveries on maps and mines. He never understood that his name would become immortal, attached to the strait, the clouds, and the penguin that bear it today. But perhaps that's fitting. The greatest achievements often come from failures. Columbus failed to find Asia but discovered the Americas. Magellan failed to survive his voyage but proved the world was round. The expedition failed in almost every stated goal, but succeeded in transforming human understanding of our planet. As I write this, we're approaching the 500th anniversary of the expedition's completion. In 1522, 18 men staggered ashore, claiming they had sailed around the world. In 2022, we live in the world they created, globalized, interconnected, with no place unexplored, no peoples unknown to each other. The age of discovery they epitomized is over. There are no more unknown oceans to cross, no more undiscovered continents to find. Or are there? As we look to space, to Mars and beyond, are we not facing the same challenges Magellan faced? The vast distances, the unknown dangers, the technological limits, the human costs? Will future historians write about the first Mars colonists the way we write about Magellan? Brave and foolish, visionary and blind, changing everything while understanding nothing? Magellan's ghost haunts every map, every GPS signal, every flight path that curves over the Pacific. The man who died trying to impose his will on the world instead gave the world to everyone. His failure was our gain. His death was our birth as citizens not of nations, but of Earth. The voyage that began with one man's wounded pride ended with humanity's expanded consciousness. The expedition that started as a quest for spices became a transformation of human understanding. The journey that seemed impossible became the proof that impossible is temporary. Ferdinand Magellan never completed his circumnavigation. He died less than halfway through, killed by his own hubris. But his vision, his obsession, his refusal to accept limits carried his expedition around the world. In failing personally, he succeeded historically. In dying for nothing, he achieved everything. The Victoria, battered and leaking, had sailed into Seville harbor carrying 18 survivors and a few tons of cloves. But it carried something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that the world was one, that all waters connected, all lands were reachable, all peoples were neighbors on a small sphere spinning in vast darkness. That knowledge changed everything, and it changes everything still. The journey continues. Every time we look at a globe, every time we cross an ocean, every time we meet someone from the other side of the world, we're living in the reality Magellan's expedition revealed. We're all sailing on the same small ship through the same vast space. There's no edge to fall off, no escape from each other, no undiscovered paradise where we can start over. We're all on the same voyage around the same world. Magellan showed us that. He died showing us that. And perhaps that's the final lesson of the first voyage around the world. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not, on a tiny sphere of rock and water, circling a star in an ocean of space far vaster than the Pacific, with no edges, no limits, and no end. The voyage continues.